As a sanctions stalemate intensifies, we have asked Professor Seyed Mohammad Marandi for his opinion, an Iranian academic, an expert on American studies and lecturer at the University of Tehran in Iran. He now joins us via Skype. A very good evening to you, Professor. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good evening.
What has been the effect of sanctions on Iran so far?
Well, actually, the latest round of sanctions, when they were implemented on November the 5th, they had no impact on the market. In fact, the rial has been inching upwards over the past few days. And I think that this is basically because the psychological effect of the sanctions has disappeared. There was a significant impact on the markets a few months ago when the first phase of the sanctions were implemented, and there was a major psychological warfare campaign going on in the Persian media language funded by the United States and its allies, such as BBC Persian, VOA, among others. But I think after a period of time that disappeared, and also after the crude murder of Jamal Khashoggi by the Saudi regime, I think that also had a major impact in the psychology of the region and the way in which Iranians perceive U.S. regional power. I think the U.S. hand has been significantly weakened.
Now, Professor, Europeans have mulled the idea of circumventing the effect. Do you see this attempt producing some desired results?
Well, Europeans have traditionally been seen as very weak in confronting the United States, no matter what happens. And we don't see them really growing a backbone at this stage. They have been making the right sort of noises, but on the ground and in reality, we haven't seen anything of substance. However, countries like Russia and China have been much more assertive in engaging with Iran and ignoring the United States, and so have a host of other countries. I think one reason why Bolton is using such abusive and insulting language towards Iranians, and one reason why Pompeo just the other day was saying that if the Iranian leaders, if they want Iranians to eat, they must abide by American demands, in other words, threatening Iran with starvation. I think this is a sign of U.S. inability to impose its will upon the Iranian people. Of course, the language used and the behavior of the regime in Washington is very disturbing, and it's very similar to their policy, their implemented policy in Yemen, alongside with the Saudis, where they've effectively created a Holocaust in Yemen. But Iran is a very powerful country, and I think that so far they failed to have the sort of impact they want to have on the country. As I said, the markets are ignoring the statements made by American officials, and we'll have to see. I think in the long term, though, the effect will gradually decrease, but I think for a period of time it will be difficult for Iranians.
Washington, Professor, is speaking in a very, I would say, threatening tone with European companies. So what kind of leverage can they use to punish those that continue to trade with Iran?
Well, the U.S. government and the U.S. president is behaving like a mafia boss. In the past, people like Obama, they would attempt to make ordinary Iranians suffer. We had similar sanctions under Obama. He called them crippling sanctions. His intention was to cripple ordinary Iranians. And of course, people died as a result of Obama's sanctions, cancer patients and others who couldn't find their medicine. And the same is true with Trump. Trump calls them brutal sanctions. So the language used by both the Obama regime and the Trump regime our language is the language of brutality and suffering. But the feeling in Tehran is that we've been through this for quite a long time. The United States has lost its credibility. Trump has lost his soft power capability, is unable to create the sort of alliances that Obama was able to do so, especially with the Europeans. And non-Western countries today are more assertive than before. And Iran is much stronger today than it was a decade ago. Iran's regional standing is much greater. Iran's alliances in the region are much stronger. And Iran's antagonists, such as the Israeli regime and the Saudi regime, especially the Saudi regime, are in a much weaker position today than before.
Washington is now demanding that Iran end policies that are rooted in the 1979 Islamist revolution, including its support for regional proxies such as the Lebanese militia Hezbollah and its development of missiles. Is this perhaps something that Tehran will bend over backwards for?
Well, these are not regional proxies. These are popular organizations. Hezbollah is a national liberation organization which has expelled the Israeli apartheid regime from southern Lebanon when they invaded it. The Iranians support the Palestinian cause against the apartheid regime, and Iran has been supporting the people of Syria against the extremists that the Americans and the Saudis have been funding for years, just as Iran supported the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa when the United States and the Europeans were supporting the apartheid regime. So no, Iran is not going to sacrifice its principles. And I think the Iranians believe that the tide has already turned against the United States because the Saudi regime is much weaker today than it was before, and the Yemeni people have shown great resilience in resisting the US Saudi imposed hunger and the Holocaust that they've imposed upon the nation. And of course, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, these countries have been able to free themselves to a large degree from American hegemony.
And of course, the International Monetary Fund has now forecast that the sanctions will cause Iran's economy to contract by 1.5% this year and about 3.6% next year. Are ordinary Iranians worried?
Well, obviously, it's going to have an impact, and the Iranians are expecting difficulty. The Iranians are already facing difficulties. Some medicines are difficult to find as we speak. Cancer patients are finding it more difficult to find certain medicines, and those medicines have become much more expensive. And of course, as I said, that's the objective of the United States. But at the end of the day, the Iranians recognize that this is these sanctions are imposed by an aggressive foreign regime with intention of humiliating the nation. And Iran is a very powerful country. The last 40 years, the revolution itself was about independence and dignity, and the Iranians are not going to relinquish that. And when the Americans and the Saudis, despite the Holocaust in Yemen, despite imposing starvation on the Yemeni people, have failed, I think that in the case of Iran, they really have no hope whatsoever.
Now, the sanctions are aimed at changing Iran's behavior and weaken its regional influence, but not change its regime in its entirety. And that said, Professor, can the doors be open to return to the negotiation table?
Well, I think the ultimate objective is to overthrow the Islamic Republic of Iran, because what is problematic for the United States is an independent Iran. As long as Iran is independent, U.S. ambitions in the region will not be fulfilled. The Iranians, of course, were already at the negotiating table. The Iranians signed the nuclear agreement. They made many sacrifices, even though the nuclear program in Iran was never had any military element at all in it. I think your viewers should read a very good book called Manufactured Crisis by Gareth Porter, which explains very carefully how this whole crisis was manufactured by the United States to put pressure on Iran. But Iran, in any case, signed the agreement. It was negotiating with the United States along with the French, the British, the Germans, the Russians, and the Chinese for a number of years. And it's the Americans that pulled out of those negotiations and pulled out of the agreement. And the Iranians say that as long as the Americans remain outside the agreement, there's nothing to negotiate. Because if the United States can't be trusted in abiding by its own commitments, then how can we negotiate anything in future when we never know whether they'll abide by future commitments?
And especially so, Professor, because now we understand that the Iranian regime has now started a course of action to break those U.S. Sanctions against Iran. And of course, they started smuggling oil, as we've seen, smuggling oil to other Arab states. And that's a matter that we're going to have to watch very closely. Thank you so much for your time, Professor. That's Professor Seyed Mohammad Marandi. He's an Iranian academic and expert on American studies and lecturer at the University of Tehran in Iran.